The audience rose slowly, not in explosive applause, but in a sustained standing ovation that carried a different energy than celebration. It was acknowledgement. It was respect. It was the recognition that they had witnessed something that would be talked about not because it was loud, but because it was restrained. As the lights dimmed slightly and the credits prepared to roll, Colbert offered one final thought. "Whatever you think about what happened here," he said, "remember this, truth doesn't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives as a question that refuses to go away." The camera pulled back. The applause continued, steady and unhurried. The studio slowly returned to motion, but the weight of the night lingered, pressing itself into memory. Viewers would debate it. Commentators would analyze it. Narratives would splinter and multiply. But for those in the room, one thing was undeniable: they had witnessed a moment where composure outweighed authority, where restraint reshaped power, and where silence spoke louder than denial. It had not been an ending. It had been an ignition. And long after the studio lights went dark, the question left behind continued to echo, not because it had been answered, but because it could no longer be ignored. It's about what happens when questions are treated like threats. The envelope still sat on the desk, unopened again, its contents now almost secondary to its symbolism. It had done its work without a single name spoken aloud, without a declaration, without spectacle. Colbert did not point to it. He did not need to. The audience had already internalized what it represented, not a conclusion, but a disruption. In moments like this, Colbert said, people often ask whether something should have been said. He tilted his head slightly. A better question is why it felt so dangerous to acknowledge it existed. The cameras swept across the audience, capturing expressions that ranged from shock to contemplation. Some viewers clasped their hands together tightly. Others stared forward, brows furrowed, as if replaying the evening in their minds. No one was checking their phones now. This was the rare moment television achieved something close to stillness, collective attention undivided, undistracted. Colbert returned to his seat, not behind the desk, but perched on its edge, reducing the distance between himself and the crowd. "Power," he said, "is very good at controlling narratives. But it's terrible at controlling silence." He paused. Because silence leaves room for thought. He allowed another beat to pass. "Tonight," he continued, "silence did more than shouting ever could." Offstage, the machinery of production waited anxiously for cues that did not come. No producer rushed in. No voice crackled through earpieces. This was a moment no one wanted to interrupt, not because it was dangerous, but because it was honest. Colbert glanced briefly toward the exit Trump had used, then back to the audience. "People will argue about what this meant," he said. "They'll debate motives, intentions, fairness." He shrugged lightly. "That's normal. What's harder," he added, "is sitting with discomfort long enough to learn from it." The doors closed behind the president with a sound that felt heavier than wood and metal should allow. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight, the unmistakable punctuation at the end of a sentence no one in the room had been prepared to read aloud. For several seconds, no one moved. The audience remained seated, eyes fixed on the empty space where power had stood moments before. The cameras did not cut away. They held the shot, understanding instinctively that absence, in this moment, spoke louder than presence ever could. Colbert remained still behind his desk, hands resting calmly, posture unchanged. He did not look toward the exit. He did not look at the envelope. He looked out at the audience, not as a performer seeking reaction, but as a witness acknowledging shared experience. The studio, once a place of rehearsed timing and predictable beats, now felt like a courtroom after a verdict had been read but not yet interpreted. The tension did not evaporate with Trump's departure. If anything, it settled deeper, transforming into something reflective, unsettling, and enduring. Finally, Colbert exhaled. It wasn't exaggerated or theatrical. It was the sound of someone releasing pressure they had deliberately carried. That, he said softly, was not planned. The understatement drew a wave of nervous laughter, quickly subdued by the audience's awareness that humor alone could not contain what had just occurred. Colbert nodded slightly, acknowledging the reaction without feeding it. But sometimes, he continued, unplanned moments tell us more than rehearsed ones ever could. The band remained silent. No cue was given. This was not the moment for music. Colbert stood slowly, not to command the room, but to level himself with it. What happened tonight, he said, isn't about a document. It isn't about a person walking out of a studio. He paused, letting the audience absorb the shift from spectacle to meaning. He did not name names. He simply glanced at the document, then folded it carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. The restraint was deliberate, and devastating. You see, Colbert said quietly, I don't need to say it. Trump turned slowly. Then why bring it? Because now, Colbert replied, you know it exists. The audience felt the full weight of that statement. Trump's face flushed deeply, his composure unraveling in visible increments. This is fake, he said, but the words lacked force. Colbert looked up. If it were, he said, you wouldn't be standing so still. The president's hands trembled slightly before he clenched them into fists. He looked toward the exit again, then back at the desk, at the envelope, at the quiet man who had somehow shifted the axis of the room without raising his voice once. You think this ends here? Trump said. Colbert shook his head. No, he said. I think it starts elsewhere. The audience erupted, not into cheers, but into sound, disbelief, realization, the collective processing of something irreversible. Trump stared at Colbert for a long moment, then turned sharply and walked off the stage, the doors closing behind him with a finality that echoed louder than applause ever could. Colbert remained seated, silent, allowing the moment to exist without commentary. The cameras lingered. The envelope sat untouched once more. The audience sat frozen, aware that they had witnessed something that could not be undone, only continued. And as the studio lights held steady, one truth settled over the room with undeniable clarity. The revelation was no longer about what had been said, it was about what could never again be unseen. The pause that followed was heavy, thick with consequence. Trump returned to his chair slowly, as though realizing that leaving now would confirm something he could not afford to confirm. He sat, hands clasped tightly, knuckles whitening. Let me ask you something, Trump said, his tone suddenly measured, almost careful. What do you gain from this? Colbert considered the question, then answered honestly. Nothing, he said. Which is why I can do it. That landed harder than any insult. The audience reacted audibly, some gasps, some whispered disbelief. Trump stared at Colbert, as though reassessing him entirely. You think you're untouchable, Trump said. No, Colbert replied. I think truth eventually touches everyone. He slid the envelope closer to the edge of the desk, not toward Trump, but toward the audience's line of sight. The cameras adjusted automatically, zooming slightly. Trump noticed, his breathing quickening. This document, Colbert said, answers a question people were told they shouldn't ask. Trump shook his head. That question doesn't exist. It does, Colbert replied gently. That's why it keeps returning. The audience leaned forward collectively. This was no longer suspense for entertainment's sake, it was the gravity of inevitability. Trump's voice rose again, frustration breaking through restraint. You don't get to define my family, he snapped. Colbert's response was immediate and calm. No, he said. But truth does. Trump stood again, pushing his chair back with a sharp scrape that echoed through the studio. This is over, he said. Colbert did not argue. He simply opened the envelope. The sound of paper sliding free was soft, almost polite, yet it cut through the room like a blade. The audience gasped. Trump froze mid-movement, his back half-turned, his body caught between leaving and witnessing. Colbert did not read aloud. Colbert broke the silence first, not with revelation, but with reflection. "It's strange," he said quietly, "how power changes rooms. When you walked in tonight, this became a different place." Trump scoffed. "Of course it did. I'm the president." Colbert nodded. "Yes. But now," he added, gesturing subtly toward the envelope, "it's something else." The audience felt the shift again. Trump leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his voice dropping. "You keep talking around it," he said. "If you've got something to say, say it." Colbert met his gaze. "Sometimes," he replied, "saying everything at once weakens the truth. Context matters." Trump laughed, but the sound lacked conviction. "You're stalling." "No," Colbert said. "I'm preparing." He reached for the envelope again, this time lifting it slightly off the desk before setting it back down. The movement was small, but it sent a ripple through the audience. Trump's eyes tracked it instinctively, his jaw tightening. "This report," Colbert continued, "exists because questions don't disappear when ignored. They ferment." Trump stood abruptly. "This is character assassination," he said. "You know that." Colbert did not rise. He looked up calmly. "Assassination implies intent," he said. "This is acknowledgement." The president's voice sharpened. "You're playing games with people's lives." Colbert's expression softened, not with sympathy, but with gravity. "No," he said. "I'm acknowledging that lives are affected whether we talk about it or not." The audience murmured again, the sound low and uneasy. Trump paced a step, then another, his movements restless. He pointed toward the cameras. "You think this makes you brave?" Colbert shook his head. "No. It makes this necessary." The pause that followed was heavy, thick with consequence. Trump returned to his chair slowly, as though realizing that leaving now would confirm something he could not afford to confirm. He sat, hands clasped tightly, knuckles whitening. Trump stared at him, breathing heavy now, the performance slipping. The audience sensed the nearing of a breaking point, the moment when restraint and reaction would collide. Colbert glanced briefly at the cameras, then back to Trump. "We'll take a short break," he said evenly. The band did not play. The lights did not change. The cameras did not cut. It was a break in name only, a pause designed to stretch the tension even tighter. Trump stood frozen, uncertain whether to leave or stay. The envelope remained unopened. The audience remained silent. And in that suspended moment, it became clear that the night had moved beyond control. Whatever came next would no longer belong to either man alone. It would belong to the story now unfolding, a story powered not by revelation yet, but by the unbearable weight of what had not been said. When Colbert announced the break, time did something strange. It didn't move forward or backward, it simply hovered. The studio lights remained fixed, the cameras stayed live, and the audience understood instinctively that this pause was not relief but pressure. Trump stood rigidly beside his chair, his body angled toward the exit but his attention chained to the desk and the envelope resting upon it. Colbert remained seated, hands folded calmly, eyes steady. It was the stillness before impact, the kind that precedes storms rather than silence. No one spoke. No one coughed. Even the hum of the studio seemed to fade, as if the building itself was listening. The break stretched longer than expected. Somewhere backstage, producers exchanged looks they would later deny having made. There were no cue cards, no music, no safety net. This was live, unfiltered, irreversible. Trump shifted his weight, then sat again, his movements sharp, impatient. He glanced toward the audience, perhaps expecting reassurance, perhaps measuring loyalty. What he found instead was attention, focused, unwavering, and no longer deferential. "There's something important to understand first," he continued. "This isn't about proving anything tonight. It's about acknowledging that some questions exist for a reason. Trump stared at him, eyes narrowed. And what reason is that? Colbert's voice softened. Because the people affected by those questions don't get to opt out of them. The studio felt impossibly still. Trump's bravado faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker so brief it might have gone unnoticed if the cameras hadn't been rolling. Colbert rested one hand lightly on the envelope. "This report," he said, "answers a question that's been whispered for years." Trump's jaw clenched. Whispered by who? By people who didn't feel safe saying it out loud, Colbert replied. The audience reacted with a low murmur, the sound of collective realization. Colbert leaned forward slightly, closing the physical distance just enough to shift the emotional one. "I'm not here to accuse," he said. "I'm here to ask whether denying the existence of a question is the same as answering it." Trump shook his head, standing again, this time more forcefully. "This is ridiculous," he said. "You're turning speculation into theater." Colbert looked up at him, unflinching. "No," he said. "I'm turning avoidance into visibility." The president's face flushed. He pointed toward the envelope. "You open that," he said, "and you'll regret it." Colbert did not respond immediately. He let the threat linger, letting the audience feel its weight, and its weakness. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle. "Regret," he said, "usually comes from waiting too long." Trump stared at him, breathing heavy now, the performance slipping. The audience sensed the nearing of a breaking point, the moment when restraint and reaction would collide. Colbert glanced briefly at the cameras, then back to Trump. "We'll take a short break," he said evenly. "It waits. And eventually, it shows up somewhere unexpected." He glanced briefly toward the envelope, then back to Trump. The audience followed the movement instinctively, as though tethered to Colbert's focus. "This document," Colbert continued, "exists whether we talk about it or not. Tonight just happens to be the night it's in this room." Trump exhaled sharply. "You're trying to trap me," he said. "No," Colbert replied. "I'm giving you a chance." The audience reacted audibly now, a collective intake of breath, a murmur of surprise. Even Trump seemed momentarily taken aback by the phrasing. "A chance," he repeated. "Yes," Colbert said. "To address something before it becomes bigger than both of us." Trump laughed again, but the sound was brittle. "Nothing is bigger than the presidency," he said. Colbert did not argue. He simply tilted his head slightly. "History might disagree," he said softly. The cameras cut briefly to the audience, capturing faces frozen in concentration, eyes wide, mouths closed. No one wanted to miss a single word. This was not spectacle anymore. It was narrative gravity pulling everything toward its center. Trump stood suddenly, the movement abrupt enough to draw a few gasps. "I don't have to sit here and listen to insinuations," he said. Colbert did not rise. He did not reach for the envelope. He remained still, his calm almost unsettling. "You don't," he said. "But if you leave, the conversation doesn't stop." That landed harder than any accusation could have. Trump hesitated, standing halfway between defiance and retreat. The audience watched, transfixed. This was a crossroads, visible and unmistakable. Trump slowly sat back down. "Say what you're going to say," he said, his voice tight. Colbert nodded, as though this outcome had always been likely. "Not yet," he said. The audience reacted again, surprised laughter mixing with tension. Colbert raised a hand gently, quieting them. "This report," Colbert said, "didn't come from the internet. It didn't come from an anonymous tip. It didn't come from politics." Trump leaned forward now, unable to stop himself. "Then where did it come from?" Colbert held his gaze. "From process," he said. From procedures that exist precisely so that truth doesn't depend on who's speaking the loudest. The president laughed sharply. Processes can be corrupted, he said. I've seen it. They can, Colbert agreed. Which is why this one was verified. More than once. The room grew colder, or at least it felt that way. The audience sensed the tightening of the narrative, the way each sentence narrowed the path forward. Trump opened his mouth to interrupt, then stopped himself, as if suddenly aware that interruption would only grant more power to what he was trying to dismiss. Colbert leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands loosely. You came here to clear things up, he said. I didn't invite you. You chose this stage. Trump bristled. Because I'm not afraid of questions. Good, Colbert replied. Then you'll understand why people ask them. He paused, then added quietly, especially when silence lasts too long. The audience felt the weight of that sentence. It echoed beyond the studio, beyond the moment, touching something deeper about authority and accountability. Trump shifted again, this time sitting straighter, his voice hardening. I've been attacked for years, he said. People make up stories. They want attention. And sometimes, Colbert said, attention finds people who didn't ask for it. The implication hovered, careful and indirect. Colbert was not accusing. He was framing. The power of the conversation lay in what he allowed the audience to connect on their own. Trump's fingers drummed once against the armrest before he stilled them. What exactly are you saying? Trump demanded. Colbert met his eyes. I'm saying, he replied evenly, that truth doesn't announce itself loudly. Colbert did not rush. He understood something fundamental about moments like this: urgency weakens impact. He let the stillness stretch, allowing the audience to fully register the shift that had taken place. People shifted in their seats, some clasping their hands together, others unconsciously holding their breath. This was no longer passive entertainment. It was participation through attention. The president cleared his throat, the sound sharp against the quiet. Let's be very clear, Trump said, his voice louder than necessary. I don't know what that is, and I don't know why you think waving papers around makes something true. Colbert nodded once, as if acknowledging a reasonable point. That's fair, he replied. Paper alone doesn't make truth. Context does. Evidence does. Time does. Trump leaned back, crossing his arms, attempting to reclaim a posture of dominance. People bring me reports all the time, he said. Most of them are wrong. And some, Colbert said calmly, are inconvenient. A ripple passed through the audience. Not laughter, recognition. Trump's jaw tightened. He uncrossed his arms, then crossed them again, a small but telling sign of agitation. Colbert continued, his tone measured. What fascinates me isn't the rumor itself. It's the reaction to it. The energy spent avoiding it. That's usually where the real story lives. Trump shook his head, smiling thinly. You're very dramatic, he said. This is supposed to be comedy. Colbert smiled back, but there was no humor in his eyes. Comedy, he said, has always been about truth. We just tell it sideways. The audience murmured softly, the kind of sound that comes not from amusement but from alignment. Colbert reached forward and slid the envelope a few inches closer to himself, not toward Trump, not away, just closer enough to reassert ownership of the moment. He still did not open it. Whispers cut short. Phones lowered. Trump's eyes locked onto the envelope. His jaw tightened. I wasn't planning to bring this up, Colbert said calmly. But since you came here to clear things up, it seemed appropriate. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had edged closer. The envelope remained unopened, its contents unknown but heavy with implication. Colbert did not touch it again. He didn't need to. Its presence alone had changed the gravity of the conversation. This, Colbert continued, is a report. Trump's smile vanished. And reports, Colbert said, his voice steady, have a way of outlasting denial. The audience sat frozen, caught in the stillness between revelation and restraint. No accusation had yet been spoken. No claim revealed. But everyone understood that the evening had crossed an invisible line. The Late Show was no longer just a show. It had become a stage for something far more consequential, a slow-burn confrontation where silence, timing, and patience were sharper than any insult. Colbert leaned back slightly, eyes never leaving the president. "We'll get to that," he said softly. And in that moment, before a single detail was disclosed, the room knew one thing with absolute certainty: whatever came next would not be forgotten. The silence that followed Colbert's last sentence did not feel empty. It felt occupied, dense with unspoken meaning, as though the room itself had absorbed the tension and was unwilling to release it. The envelope lay untouched on the desk, perfectly ordinary in appearance, yet it had already altered the balance of the evening. Cameras lingered on it longer than necessary, instinctively aware that objects sometimes carry more power than words. Trump's gaze flicked toward the audience and then back to Colbert, calculating, reassessing. He had walked into the studio expecting confrontation, perhaps even spectacle, but not this kind of restraint. Not this quiet control. "That's true," he said. "Which is why transparency matters." The word transparency landed heavily. The audience leaned forward, sensing the tone shift from spectacle to inquiry. Colbert did not accuse. He did not provoke. He framed the conversation like a doorway rather than a trap, inviting the president to step through on his own. Trump responded with familiar language: achievements, victories, loyalty, family. He spoke of strength and success, of resilience against critics. But something in his cadence had changed. The ease was gone. Colbert watched closely. Every pause. Every breath. Every unnecessary repetition. He let Trump speak, fully aware that the longer he talked, the more the absence of clarity became visible. When Trump finally slowed, Colbert spoke again. "Families," Colbert said softly. "They're complicated. Especially when they live under a spotlight." Trump stiffened slightly, though he nodded in agreement. "Very complicated," he said. "And sometimes," Colbert continued, "the stories people tell about families say more about secrecy than scandal." The audience grew quiet. Even the band remained still. Trump opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time since entering the studio, he seemed unsure which direction the conversation was headed. Colbert straightened, resting his hands flat on the desk. "I want to be clear," he said. "This isn't about gossip. It's about truth. And tonight, I think people deserve to understand why certain questions never get answered." Trump shifted in his chair. The cameras caught it, a subtle movement, but unmistakable. The president who thrived on command now appeared reactive, listening instead of leading. Colbert reached beneath the desk, his movement slow, deliberate, unmistakable. He withdrew a plain, unmarked envelope and placed it gently on the desk between them. The sound it made, soft paper against wood, echoed louder than expected. The audience reacted instantly. A collective inhale. The distance between them, a few feet of polished floor, suddenly felt immense. Trump spoke at length, as he often did, weaving broad statements about rumors, dishonesty, people saying things they shouldn't. His words moved confidently but landed vaguely, like arrows aimed at shadows. He dismissed accusations without naming them, denied claims without clarifying their origin. To the untrained ear, it might have sounded convincing. But to the audience, something felt incomplete. The more he spoke, the more questions multiplied. Colbert listened without interruption, his posture relaxed, eyes attentive. He did not nod in agreement, nor did he challenge the statements outright. He simply waited. Late-night interviews thrive on rhythm, Question, answer, laughter, applause. Colbert disrupted that rhythm deliberately. When Trump finally paused, expecting either affirmation or confrontation, Colbert allowed silence to stretch between them. The audience felt it like a held breath. Silence, when wielded correctly, can be more disarming than accusation. Trump shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket, filling the pause with a quick remark that landed nowhere. Colbert leaned forward just enough to signal a shift. "Mr. President," he said evenly, "you mentioned rumors." Trump nodded quickly. "A lot of them. Terrible things. I want to talk about one of them," Colbert continued, his tone calm, almost conversational. "Because it keeps coming up. Not in headlines. Not officially. But quietly." A murmur rippled through the audience. Trump's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. He smiled, but the smile did not reach his eyes. "You can understand," Colbert said, "why people wonder about the things leaders refuse to explain." Trump laughed, a short, sharp sound meant to dismiss the implication. "People wonder about everything," he replied. "That's what they do." Colbert nodded once, acknowledging the deflection. That was when the doors opened. At first, there was confusion, a ripple of motion, heads turning instinctively. Then recognition struck like a shockwave. Walking into the light, framed by cameras and stunned silence, was President Donald Trump. For a moment, the studio ceased to function like a television set and became something else entirely. People froze mid-breath. Some audience members instinctively clapped before realizing they weren't sure why they were clapping. Others gasped openly. A few laughed nervously, unsure whether this was satire, a bit, or something real unfolding far too quickly to process. Trump moved forward with a familiar confidence, his posture rigid, his expression composed, a half-smile fixed in place as if daring the room to challenge him. He raised a hand in acknowledgement, absorbing the attention like oxygen. The applause was uneven, scattered, laced with uncertainty. Colbert did not move. He stood behind his desk, hands resting lightly on the surface, watching the president approach. His face revealed nothing, no surprise, no fear, no delight. Just focus. This was not how the show was scheduled to go, and everyone in the room understood that instinctively. Trump stopped short of the chair across from the desk, choosing instead to remain standing. The cameras adjusted. The director hesitated, then let the shot run. "Live television has a way of surrendering control to moments like this that I thought I'd come in myself," Trump said, his voice filling the studio with practiced authority. "Clear up a few things." The phrase hung in the air. Clear up a few things. The audience shifted, sensing that the words carried more weight than they revealed. Colbert tilted his head slightly, acknowledging the statement without endorsing it. He gestured calmly toward the chair, inviting Trump to sit. The president hesitated, then complied, lowering himself into the seat with measured control. In an alternate version of America, one where television studios sometimes became arenas for history rather than entertainment, the night began with nothing more than expectation. The Late Show studio glowed with its familiar warmth, polished wood, soft blue lighting, the low hum of conversation drifting through the audience like static before a broadcast. People laughed quietly, checked their phones, leaned toward companions, all of them believing they understood the rhythm of the evening. A monologue. Applause. A few jokes sharp enough to sting but safe enough to laugh at. That was the promise of late-night television, and Stephen Colbert had delivered it countless times before. Yet on this night, something beneath the surface felt different, though no one could quite name it. The air carried a pressure, subtle but persistent, as if the room itself were holding a secret it was not yet ready to reveal. Colbert stepped onto the stage to his usual wave of cheers, his stride relaxed, his smile practiced but genuine. He acknowledged the audience with a nod, a quick wave, the confidence of someone completely at home under the lights. The opening jokes landed smoothly, laughter rising and falling on cue, but there was an edge beneath the humor, a faint seriousness that only the most attentive viewers might notice. Colbert lingered slightly longer between punchlines, letting silence stretch just a beat too long, as though he were testing how much stillness the room could tolerate. Cameras rolled. Applause signs flashed. Everything looked normal. And yet, somewhere behind the curtain, something was already in motion, midway through the monologue. Before the audience could fully settle into the rhythm of laughter, Colbert paused. Not the quick pause of a comedian waiting for applause to die down, but a deliberate stillness. The band quieted. The audience laughter faded into uncertain murmurs. Colbert glanced toward the side of the stage, his expression unreadable.